Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival 2021. This year the festival returns with the theme Mulat Sarira, self-reflection, which is drawn from a Balinese Hindu philosophy. From 8 until 17 of October, we will explore the meaning of self-reflection, cultural introspection, and human rights, examining who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our actions. Today, I'm very excited to be presenting Mirandi Riwoe, who is the author of Stone, Sky, Gold, Mountain, and for which she won the Queensland Literary Award for Fiction 2020 and the ARA Historical Novel Prize 2020. It was also shortlisted for the Stella Prize and longlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. Her novella, The Fish Girl, was shortlisted for the Stella Prize and the Queensland Literary Award for Fiction. Welcome, Mirandi, to today's session.
Thank you so much for having me, Janet.
Always delighted to have a chat to you. And of course, we're especially fond of you because of your Indonesian heritage. So and we're always thrilled to see that present itself in your work. But let's start talking about your fantastic novel, Stone, Sky, Gold, Mountain. I'm curious that you started off, I guess, well, with the gold rush era, but also the fact that it's set in North Queensland, in that part of Australia. Where did you start with your research?
Okay. At first, because I was writing about I wanted to write about the earlier Chinese here in Australia, that sort of took me to the gold rush period. And at first I did most of my research. Well, I did a lot of reading first, obviously, but then I went to Melbourne a couple of times because they've got great museums. They've got the, museum for immigrants, and then nearby there's Bendigo and Ballarat, where there were, lots of gold digging back in the day. But a lot is known about the Victorian sort of gold rush. So I decided, and I'm from Queensland, I'm from Brisbane. So I decided maybe I would set my novel in Queensland. And I sort of, as far as the research went, I sort of moved my way up the coast. Like I was looking at different places along the way, like Gympie and, further up until I got to Cairns. There were, river beds in Cairns that were, dug for gold. And then I came across Cooktown and the Palmer River sort of gold rush. And the good thing about that gold rush is that there's a lot of information on it. Because they've got, in Cooktown, they've got great museums and everything. There's lots of information about the gold diggers there. But also, like, the town I eventually chose, which was Maytown, existed, and it was a bustling village at the time. But there's nothing there now. So it was easier for me, like, because it was real, but it was not there anymore. I could invent in that space. Like, there was information about that space of the period, but also I could invent in that space as well. So it sort of gave me some parameters, but also gave me a lot of leeway to sort of work with my characters.
So you decided to write first about the Chinese in Australia, and then that led you to focusing on the gold rush.
That's right. So what happened is I had written some crime fictions set in Victorian London, and I'd done a lot of research into, the sort of Asian community in London in the 60s, and then I wrote those novels, but I wanted to write something for an Australian audience set in Australia, and my father's of Chinese Indonesian heritage. So it just made sense to me because I'd been writing about these Eurasian and Asian characters in Victoria. I wanted to write about sort of maybe the earlier Chinese here, and there were earlier Chinese than the ones who were in the gold rush, but the gold rush just seemed a sort of rich, I guess, place to start. So that's where I started with my research. So it came from a personal place. Also, what happened is through my life, because I was brought up here Eurasian, but certainly when I was growing up in the 1970s, there weren't many Asian or Eurasian people in Brisbane. So since then, I've always been fascinated when I meet people who sort of present as white Australian, that they say, they'll say something like, oh, my granddad or my great granddad up in Mareeba was Chinese, all these stories about these quite long family, sort of Eurasian family ties. And I've always been fascinated in how those early relationships, like in the 1860s and 1870s, given racism and given how white Australia was, how did they sort of blossom these relationships or not, that sort of, all these children came from it, and, their children and the relatives now. So I've always been sort of fascinated with those sort of relationships. So I wanted to write about the early Chinese, but I also wanted to write about a relationship, a breakdown of the relationship of getting to know each other in those sort of the atmosphere of, maybe white Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I remembered reading how in Australia, actually, more people than you imagine have actually a Chinese background because of the gold rush. Yeah,
it's astounding.
You can tell often. Yes. Yeah, you can often tell by their eyes, because we have a family friend too, and we always say to him, "You're part Asian for sure." So, yeah, just go back a few generations.
What's funny is, though, sometimes you only see it once you hear it. Then you hear it and you go, "Oh, of course you are." Yeah. I just love it. I just love it because
I do too.
I just really love it.
Yeah, me too. I agree. I was thinking about it, and why did all the Chinese come out to Australia? I mean, the Indonesians didn't, did they? I mean, why was it they were all jumping on boats sailing over here?
That's such a good point. I think there were I couldn't find much on them, or else I would have written about them, but there were a certain amount of Javanese who came here at the time to work as coolies, I guess, or on plantations, from the South Pacific as well. There's not a lot of information on them, who work on sugar farms and things. I think what happened with the Chinese, and actually since then I've also read studies of how, especially the British and the Dutch, they moved. There was a lot of human trafficking. There was a lot of human trafficking, almost like the slavery in America, of where and like I was talking before about a novella I've written about Anna the Javanese, who was one of Gauguin's models.
Yes, and I love that painting. It's one of my favorite paintings.
Yes, well, I've written a novella about it coming out next year. Anyway,
you know her story, don't you? You must know.
I know.
I'm so excited. Oh my God, I'm so excited.
Well, I had to fill in some gaps, but but
so I get off the track,
which is what I love to do. So there was a lot of this trafficking of people from those Southeast Asian countries that had been colonized. But I think the Chinese, so they'd already gone through the gold rush in America, which was their first gold rush, and they were called, so they called the men who went to America, they called them Gold Mountain Men. And then when they came to Australia later, they were the New Gold Mountain Men. That's what they were called. And what happened is there was a lot of warfare in China itself at the time, a lot of poverty, so they were looking to do whatever they could to make money. And so it became this huge thing. And what they would do is they had, I guess it was like human trafficking now, like they would be sent by a local conglomerate of some sort, or, you know, where they'd be lent the money that they'd have to, you know, pay back once they got there. And of course, that didn't always happen. I mean, there was a lot of hardship. So, yeah, I think maybe that was the difference between being maybe a colonized country and a country that wasn't colonized, you know, that they were, different circumstances.
I don't think they were better.
Took them
I don't think they were better
overseas.
looked after. They probably. I don't think they could.
Oh no,
read,
they
that's
weren't being
all.
looked after, but different circumstances to why they were going overseas.
Because I was.
That's
just
a great
thinking,
question. I haven't thought of that before, really.
Well, I just
like why
thought, you know,
China?
I mean, even to this day, the Chinese are extraordinary, aren't they? They, you know, their kids study all over the world, and they're amazing. So, but I just suddenly thought, hang on, Indonesia's closer. Why weren't they here? Maybe because they didn't. Maybe because they didn't have rice fields. I don't know. But also that idea of children actually sailing and kind of being sold by their parents. Gosh, what a difficult life it was back then.
I got that from a person who was writing in the Times or something in Britain, and just talking about how sad it was to see this woman on the side of the road, you know, I guess actually selling their children into some sort of servants or to work, you know, like as coolies overseas, that sort of thing. And I mean, these things are still happening, you know, they're still happening in many countries around the world. So when I read that, I thought, well, that could be one of the predicaments, you know, of why my characters came to the gold rush. And I also read another great memoir by a man who came over, but he must have been a very young man, but he came over with his brother and father. So so a lot of young people and older people came here to dig for gold, which is fascinating.
Well, I suppose too, we always tend to read about the gold rush from a white man's perspective, but in this case, your concern in this case was the visitor, the Chinese, or any visitor.
I think what it was too is you know, whenever we think of the Chinese and the gold rush, you're always thinking of them as this huge mass, you know, the Chinese. It's not like individuals. So that was also, you know, like you were asking before, like what brought them here. Well, then I could actually give you know, reasons for why they came here as individuals, not just to, like, you know, pillage the place, you know, because the rhetoric was, you know, the same as now, like they're just trying to take over the world, and they, you know, like they're taking everything, and they're, you know, actually the rhetoric, So I was just interested in, and I think that's where fiction can sort of help, in that it can, people, when you look at an individual like that in their story, it sort of builds empathy more than if you're reading in the newspaper about these hordes who are a threat, you know. And actually, you know, when you've got a couple like that, they're not a threat. They're just trying to do the best they can for themselves too.
It's about survival, isn't it? Everybody's trying to survive at the end of the day, aren't they? So
yes, that's right.
So I mean, you created an amazing sense of location. You know, when you read the book, you're there, don't you think? You're kind of in that environment.
Thank you, Janet.
It's true. Until I was sort of, oh gosh, and then also, I think there's this amazing sense of gratitude when you read it, because I was so happy I was in a, you know, a comfortable house and not in their circumstances. So
I know.
Isn't it though grim? So did you actually go to that area and spend time there to get a sense of the nature?
I did, and it was the best thing. It's my favorite thing to do as an author, actually, is to actually go to the place as part of the research and see it as my character. So the great thing was, like in Cooktown, as an example, you know, I was trying to see it as they would have seen it when they first arrived. And then, you know, and my husband is a botanist anyway, which was very handy. And we, so like those, I mentioned those beach almonds or something, you know, at the beginning. And he's the one who pointed that out to me. And I was thinking, well, you know, back in the day, it would have just been plucked dry, that tree, you know, with thousands of Chinese arriving, you know, straight off the boat. So that sort of thing is just really handy to do as the writer to sort of get into the head of your character and how they're seeing it. And then we drove to the Palmer River area. We went and looked at where Maytown is. So Maytown at the time was this thriving town that had, like I always say, to show how thriving it was, it had a lemonade factory, you know, and then but it also had like a post office and you know, police station, all that sort of thing. But also but there now all it is like dirt road, and not even a dirt road, it just happens to still the road it's dirt and all just bush. There's still some stumps there from where the post office was and some bricks from where the bakery was. And somewhere along the line, the community's put in along the road, they put in plaques where the shops were, or, you know, the bakery was, of who owned them. And a lot of them are Chinese, you know. I think that was the other thing I was trying to show was that, you know, at the time they say there were up to 20,000 Chinese in that area and up to 5,000 white Australians, or white people, or people who'd come in from Europe. So there were actually many more Chinese, and most of the businesses were run by Chinese, especially like the butchers and that in Cooktown, which I think people don't realise. It must have looked very Chinese. It must have looked very like Chinatown, you know. And like there's a book called, you know, which I love, It's Raining in Mango by Thea Astley. And it starts in Maytown as well. And hers is about, you know, a journalist who's in town and his wife and everything. It starts there. And she does mention the Chinese, but I think it probably doesn't do justice to how Chinese that little town must have been at the time, which is just astounding now, because, of course, all of that was wiped out by, you know, 20 years later by the White Australia policy. So, but anyway, getting back to Maytown. So then I could see how Maytown was situated. There's a great map of what was there and how it was divvied up between who and all the names. And then we camped there. And because I was with my botanist sort of forestry guy, he, you know, then he could tell me what all the trees were and what all the, then I could listen for the birds, and there was like a, you know, cattle, and there was, you know, so because and, you know, owls, and, you know, I took notes. Obviously, I was just taking notes the whole time and everything. And then I sort of could give them to my characters in the book. And what I wanted was, Ying is very much a character who is engaged with the world. Like, she wants to, you know, she's adventurous. You know, she wants to embrace everything. Whereas Lai Yu, I wanted him to see it maybe even in a sort of more misogynist light, and also as an outsider. Like, that's how I wanted him to sort of see the landscape. So they both see the landscape differently. Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, you have children yet. Do you think women are just more adapters to new places than males? Are you allowed to say that nowadays? But I know my own kids. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I guess that's constrained by social circumstances as well. Like, maybe back in the day too, men would have seemed more adventurous. They were the ones, you know, going off and like finding these places. But I do, when you hear about the sort of the wives that joined them in these places and what they then had to, you know, live, how they had to live. It is extraordinary. Yeah.
So tell us now about these siblings. So they both, and I don't know how much to say, you know, I don't want to give it all away. But, you know, they both sailed out, just the two of them. Yeah,
they did. So they wanted to leave after the mother sort of had to, I guess, put her other children into servitude. They kind of escape, and Ying's a girl, but she wants to stay with Lai Yu, her big brother. But what happened is, back then, women weren't encouraged to come to Australia. Chinese women weren't encouraged to come to Australia by the Australian government, because they didn't want the Chinese to settle. But also the Chinese didn't want their women coming here because it was quite rough, you know. So she actually disguises herself as a boy, as her brother, Lai Yu's brother. So she can just be on the goldfields with him. And he's the eldest brother. So he's taken the initiative to do this trip to try and sort of, they've lost, they're nearly losing their farm. And he's taken this initiative to try and get back sort of the riches and the younger siblings and everything. Yep.
So you talked about how she disguised herself as a boy. There was was that idea of shaving the head here or something?
Yeah, because they shaved they shaved the top of their head, but still had to have the queue. Whereas women obviously still had long hair, but didn't necessarily have to shave all the way back. And I guess clothing was different anyway. So she just did what she could to become a boy. I didn't actually find any information on it actually happening. You'd think maybe it did though, but anyway, I didn't find any actual sort of evidence of that. So what I did is I looked at other women who'd sort of lived life as men, you know, through history. And the surprising thing is a lot of them actually lived like in very male kind of work situations, you know, like in the Navy or, you know, like, you know, like in the army or something, which is fascinating. And were only found out like at the time of their death kind of thing, you know, an autopsy or whatever. So that to me was quite, that to me was quite interesting as well. And, you know, and the other interesting thing is, and she does it in a totally different way, but Pam Zhong, her book, How Much of These Hills Are Gold, I think, came out much the same in America, came out much the same. It came out the same month as my book, thank God, because I would have looked like I copied her otherwise. But she also has two siblings in her novel, in Gold Rush America, and one of them dresses as a boy. So that was quite a coincidence.
Isn't that amazing? So how much do you think with Ying dressing as a boy, how much do you think that affected her character?
I think actually she probably was always, you know, sort of that more easygoing. You know, I think she probably just is that. That's her personality anyway. But she certainly, once she was a boy, and especially when she got to Maytown herself and was left alone when Liu went off to do his other job, she certainly comes to appreciate the freedoms she has as a boy compared to like as a girl. Yeah.
And tell us about Layu. You know, Layu in Indonesian means Layu. It's already, but anyway, like wilted. You know, like something like. So is one word. So his character is quite complex. Yeah, tell us about his issues and also the mysterious Shan. You know, this mystical.
Shan. You know what? Originally, Janet. He wasn't. He was going to be, you know, one of the cast of characters, but it was going to be just Miriam and Ying, the book, and it was going to be something like, I was going to call it something like Gold Mountain Women, you know, because they were called Gold Mountain Men. Anyway, what happened is, I guess his part of the story, I guess, was just going to be told through Ying, you know. But his story, I guess, in my mind started to grow, and there was one line, and I won't say what the line is because it gives it away, but there was one line that I was reading about a shepherd, a Chinese shepherd, and it was about 1860, a Chinese shepherd in Victoria who worked alone as a shepherd, and what happened to him. And it was just one line, but it was just really moving, and it actually created the whole trajectory for Liu, you know, how he goes on his trek and then he's got to, you know, become a shepherd, blah blah blah. So he's got an immense amount of pressure on him because he's the eldest son, and he's put it on himself that he's going to like go back and save the farm and save his mom and save the kids, you know. And it was really interesting. So all these things sort of feed into it as you're reading, you know, as you're creating a character. I was in Shanghai for a residency, which was brilliant, for 2 months, and I sort of concentrated on his narrative arc while I was there. Like what I was writing was mostly just him because he needed more tension. And I didn't want to lose the tension in, usually I just write from A to Z. Like I would usually write, you know, like just to keep them, I guess, all doing the same thing. But with him, I just wrote his whole one at the same time to get that tension. But, and there was this lovely poet who was actually from a Greek family, I think, and he was in Shanghai and he read some of his poetry, and he also wrote about that he wished he wasn't the only son. you know, in this Greek family. And it was just really beautiful. And I thought, well, that's like Lai Yu. He probably wishes he wasn't the eldest son, like having that pressure. And he already has, like, I guess, you know, anxiety, or, you know, he has some mental illness anyway. But that aside, then around this, it must have been before that, I'd read an article. So it's only a few years old, an article in the New Yorker about women in New York, or people in New York, Chinese people in New York, being, I guess, conned by a group who was sort of taking them aside after church or something and saying, oh my gosh, my spiritual friend can tell that, you know, your son is being haunted by a ghost bride, and you better, you got to do all these special things to stop him from, you know, from stopping the ghost bride from, you know, taking him to heaven, you know, like killing him. By, you know, you better come bring all your jewelry and all these things. It was a real elaborate con that some Chinese people were still believing, you know. And then, of course, I looked into ghost brides and everything. So I guess with Lai Yu, he has his ghost bride, Shan, who he was engaged to, but I don't even, like, people ask me, and I would say I don't even know if she's real, or, you know, like, it could be either thing. Like, it could be part of his mental illness. It could be she's real, because it's not like I don't believe in ghosts. So I just let, I guess, his story do the talking, you know.
Was his fate typical? I mean, are we giving away too much again when we say that? I mean, you know, you say he had a lot of pressure on his shoulders.
I wouldn't say typical, but I would say, you know, the memoirs that I did read, I mean, it was a hard slog. And of course, a lot of Chinese went there, and then they sort of pivoted to other things, you know, like gardening or being, you know, having shops, you know, where they did well. I mean, a lot of those areas back in the day wouldn't have survived, those small townships wouldn't have survived without the Chinese gardeners and corner shops, you know. So I would say there was a lot of hardship. I would, you know, and I think some people, actually, when we were in Cooktown, it was interesting. There was, where we stayed, the man who owned the place was telling my husband that they often got Chinese come to stay who were visiting the area because that's where their family wealth came from, you know, which I think that's really beautiful, you know. But I mean, many people did not find wealth. Like I guess any person that goes to the gold rush, you know. I wouldn't say it was typical, but I wouldn't say it's you know, and a lot of people, like, even on the Palmer River, there's Chinese cemeteries, you know, and in the local cemeteries up north, there's always the Chinese part, you know, like a lot of people, which is sad, did come here and they didn't survive it.
And so let's move on to Miriam's character. So she's quite unusual in the story as well.
Miriam. Yeah, you know, Miriam, I got the name from, I went to Chinchilla just for a few days, and we walked through. They have a beautiful, you know, old cemetery here in Queensland. And we were sort of wandering around it, and there were 2 or 3 Miriams, you know, not Miriam or Mariam or anything. It was Miriam, and I just really liked that it was different, but obviously from the period. So that's how I came up with her name, and then I really liked that it could be sort of shortened to Mary. That worked out just nicely. And I used to always say things like, well, she was probably the most sort of made up out of my characters, but in fact, when I think about it, she probably represents, you know, from my mother's sort of Irish heritage, English Irish heritage, you know, Australian, those stories that you hear of, you know, like old, you know, aunt blah 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 went out, you know, had 10 kids, like the grandma went and had 10 kids, but her and the eldest went off, and then she came back with a baby, but the eldest daughter never came back, you know, and all these stories, you know, like that somebody's kid actually looks like the uncle, you know, like all those sort of stories that, you know, filter through, you know, the Irish side of your family. I realized, and you know, just as a woman, that sort of, I mean, I was just watching something the other night that frustration and anger at how babies were taken off women, you know, because they weren't married and things like that. I mean, it's just so devastating, and there's no going back for those women. Like, there's no going back for those women. The time's been spent. You know, so I guess that sort of thing interests me, like I say, I've said before, just because it sort of outrages me a bit. So, and, with that first series I wrote, there was, I did look into women and sex work a lot. I wanted to look at sort of sexuality, but also, the position that women had that sort of, or in society that forced them into sex work or not. Like sometimes it was a choice because there was a better choice than other things they had to do in that, that period. If you weren't born affluent, So I think she just came from, sort of family stories all sort of cobbled together. And I even, my mother lives in Queanbeyan, and that's why, probably why she comes from Queanbeyan herself. Yeah.
And then so tell us about her job, her work.
Oh, okay. So I guess what I wanted to show was that she's a fallen woman anyway, through the same old sort of story, young woman, like seduced, whatever, or not, but same old story. And I guess in my head, she's worked her way up the coast in different sort of maid jobs, and somewhere along the line, because of her background, she's fallen in with Sophie. Now, Sophie originally was set, in I read about a sex worker in Melbourne in probably the 1800s, and she was allegedly murdered by some Chinese men, which sort of originally, like in the story, I was going to have maybe that she's murdered by Chinese men and my characters are suspected, that sort of thing. So, it was just one of those early sort of things that you're thinking of. And that sex worker's name was Sophie. So that's how I got Sophie. So I guess in my mind, they sort of fell in with each other somewhere, and Miriam sort of come along as her sort of housekeeper maid, like grudgingly, but that's her work. And she's fond of Sophie anyway. But and also Sophie's, well, that other woman in town, Penny, I think she's based on, there was a very famous madam, I guess, in that area in the period called something Kate, something like she was very famous. She had, very, and actually Thea Astley even writes about her in her novel as well. So I guess that's sort of like they all sort of gel together in my mind. How these characters would develop. Yeah.
So am I allowed to ask you, why did you decide that the outcome of the attack? Can I say that? And you can decide how much you want to tell people.
The attack on.
So you talk about an attack on Sophie. Yeah.
The outcome. You don't mean so the attack? Yeah, so the attack was sort of.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was an attack, and she didn't die. Because I thought she was going to die, and she survived. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. At the time, I guess with my fiction, what I like to do is, even though it's set in the past, it is actually always, I guess, inspired by things that are happening now. And I guess what I do try to show is that that some of the things that were happening then that we think are so dreadful are still happening, like domestic violence and racism. Are two things that, really annoy me. So, so like the racist scene in the shop was actually inspired by a racist thing I saw on YouTube, like an attack in a local RSL pub, and I just took some of the, I guess, the emotions and the words from that attack on YouTube and sort of made them, happen in the shop, which is, ridiculous. And then on the ABC again, I was watching a show on domestic violence, and and that probably directly informed how I described what happened to Sophie. And like I said, it also tied in with that original idea I had of that was inspired by that sex worker who was murdered in Melbourne by Chinese people, because the word was, maybe it wasn't a very, the investigation was a bit lax, But actually I've looked into it more, and I think maybe it was a couple of Chinese men. But I did want to so that was my initial kind of impetus there, and then it sort of melded in with actual domestic violence that would, you know, is still such a prevalent problem for women in Australia. So yeah, it's just interesting that I can sort of tie these things in that are still happening.
So, who was your favourite character in the story? Who did you love the most?
Oh, that's really hard. I really loved writing Liu. Like, I just really, I probably felt most sort of visceral about him. Probably and I really feel for Miriam. I think she's, but probably if I was going to be mates with one of them, it'd be Ying. And she's sort of just, her outlook is like, I think a bit like my dad. Like, my dad is very like that, like just embraces life, just get on with it. You have a bit of a, you know, setback, you just like get up again, keep going. And he's so, you know, what's the word? Like, just wants to explore everything. Yeah, real go-getter. So I guess her character is sort of based on his, on him. Yeah. So probably if I was friends with one of them.
What do you think would have happened in her situation if she had decided to stay on?
Yeah, I don't know. Look, there are so many options. Like, I have thought, maybe in another novel I'll just mention, because I do have an idea about doing something in North Queensland again, or about a Eurasian family. And I thought, well, maybe in another novel there can be like a shop that's run by like this Australian woman and a Chinese man or something, you know, like, or whatever. I guess for me, I don't even know. It's like the Shan question. I don't even know what happened to her. Because there are so many options that could have happened to her, like real life. Well, maybe she just, you know, went back to being a girl in China, or maybe she's adventurous and she just like does, you know, there are so many options for her. And I'd like to think too, because of the type of character she is, whatever option she'd taken or she takes, she'd be happy. She'd be happy because she's that person. Yeah, she would take whatever, you know, and do the best she could with it.
Yeah, I was wondering that too. Like, was she happy going back? Well, as you say, I guess from her nature being so.
Yeah, because you could, you know, because you'd be looking forward to going home and, you know, maybe seeing your family and everything, but also like, you like being out doing all this stuff and everything, and she's young, and it's hard. It's hard to know.
So what was the time frame? Because I know, like, from my kids, you know, when they have moved to Australia or whatever from here, for the first 2 years, it's really difficult. You know, it's very hard to fit in or understand Aussie language, you know. But after the 2-way mark, and I've heard this from a lot of people, they start to feel more at home. So what was the time frame when they arrived in Queensland to when, for example, Ying left? How many years are we talking about?
No, that would have been months. It would have been months, not years.
Okay.
It would have been all within a year, I'd say. Yes, definitely. They would have. I mean, even just the track to the gold, to the river. Took months, you know. But then they were there for probably, I think I had it for a few months, but then they just didn't get enough gold, and so they moved into town. That would have been a few months. Like, I would say it all would have been within, you know, a year. Yes.
And what ages were they? I can't remember. I remember thinking, I can't remember how old they were. I couldn't tell.
17 and he was 19. I remember, like, because I don't love giving those specifications in a book, you know, like, I'm not one that really, no, I don't mind, but I'm not one to, when I'm writing, to look at, you know, like what they look like. I just really admire books that don't, you know. But I remember my editor made me put ages down, so I think it was 17 and 19, because in my mind, like around that age.
I couldn't.
That's so she was the youngest sister.
I was wondering that. Your editor has my mind too. So getting to the process of writing, how do you start? I mean, how do you actually start to write the book?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's really hard, Janet. I'm trying to do it now. It's really hard. So what I did is, say with my first novel, which was set in the Victorian period, I researched for a good year beforehand, and it wasn't just about the period and what they wore and blah blah blah, but it was also a lot of fiction and non-fiction, but it was also to do with ideas as well, like what sort of ideas I would scaffold the book with. But also, so I was looking at fiction and non-fiction from the period, from now, about the period, you know, that sort of thing. And that took a good year. And I remember after that first year, I did write in this diary, I wrote something like, I will never be able to write a historical fiction. This is, you know, I'll never, you know. Anyway, and then a year later, I found that diary. And by the time I found the diary again, I'd written the novel. So that felt really good. And so I guess when I got to this one, Stone, Sky, Gold, Mountain, I already had that scaffolding of knowing about the Victorian period, you know, like I guess what people were reading in the papers or how they were dressed, even just those sort of really, really basic things. That sort of scaffolding was always already there. So then I moved on to a lot of non-fiction on the Chinese here. There was a great book called Sojourners that sort of gathered up all the newspaper information about the Chinese being here at the time. I read a lot of like first-hand accounts by, I guess, white settlers here about what it was like being up there. Like, this is after my initial sort of run at Victoria and doing all that sort of basic gold rush. The worst part was like all the gold digging information as well. Like, you know, I didn't know how much sort of detail do you go into, you know, like on the actual gold digging, because they had such different ways. Like there was either, you know, like with machinery, or they were, you know, with the panhandling, you know, all that sort of stuff. So not you know, with that thing they had. So it was really hard deciding all those sort of things, but I guess best was the first-hand accounts. I got some really interesting things from there. I guess once I moved up to the North Queensland, my research for North Queensland, what actually came out, even though I wanted to write this book about a love story between, you know, a cultural sort of exploration of this love story between two culturally diverse characters. Actually, once I did all the research on North Queensland, what becomes really apparent is actually how terribly the Gugu-Yalanji people, the local Aboriginal people, were treated, and by everyone, like, and the circumstances, you know, that there was, you know, that they lost their land and they, you know, they were murdered, you know, so all that sort of thing. So it sort of had to become a different book, because you can't write about North Queensland and not consider that context, you know. It actually became all about that really in the end. So yeah, it was very interesting, the research, and that again took probably a good year or so of just really immersing myself in the literature and going there and, you know, like going to Victoria and everything before I put pen to paper. And I think I got a Griffith Review gave me a fellowship to write the first chapter, which sort of spurred me on. And then Shanghai was good for writing Lai Yu. So it sort of started to fall into place. But I do definitely need to do a lot of research first, just to, you know, you pick up ideas in research, but just to feel comfortable enough to start the fiction side of things.
I mean, you touched on a really, interesting point, the whole Aboriginal story. That was interesting how you wove that in. I wanted to show that, you know, the displacement and the deaths of the Aboriginal people, you know, that the Chinese were just as complicit in it, you know. So I guess aspects of my book, I didn't want to write, obviously I didn't want to appropriate any voices and write from a Gugu-Yalanji point of view, and there are other writers doing that, you know, from, you know, their own stories. But I decided just from those first-hand accounts I'd read, I could write, you know, by white men, I could write those experiences from my Chinese, you know, from my Chinese characters' point of view, like they maybe seen these things that were written about.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show, just by even being there and those huge numbers, they were, you know, very much complicit in what was happening.
I mean, they're all victims too, weren't they? I mean, the Chinese too, just trying to survive and having to deal with all of that. You know, bringing in the Chinese element. I mean, given that they've been in Australia for so long, what do you think is the general opinion about them? I mean, certainly COVID hasn't helped, but
no,
you know,
isn't that interesting? You know, obviously when I wrote it, it was to write back against that sort of racism that still exists, you know, to a certain degree. But then COVID happened the same. So March, my book came out in March, the same month we all went into lockdown. And I was like, oh my God, this is terrible timing, you know, like this book that I'm trying to build up, you know, like empathy or understanding for, you know, like these Chinese individuals who came here. You know, and somebody said to me, no, Mirandi, maybe it's good timing, you know, to remind people of these, you know, that they're individuals, you know, and different stories and why they're here. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they represent, you know, the Chinese government or some, you know, somebody else that's, you know, like in the papers. But yeah, certainly like those COVID, the attacks on Chinese people or Asian people even was, you know, another thing that angered me last year, you know, like it was so horrible and so unnecessary and stupid. And I can see comes from a place of fear, but still not fair. And I guess I write about racism once in a while because I actually, when I was growing up here, did not experience any or a lot of racism. I looked different and I was very conscious of being different, but I was never not that sort of horrible racism that you do hear about. And I actually wonder if it's worse now. And certainly my son, he's only a quarter now Chinese Indonesian, but he's as say dark as I am. And you know, when he was in high school and he's a skateboarder, and certainly him and his friends who might be from, you know, African Australians or whatever, the racism they copped was like worse, I think, than when I was young. So I guess that's why I still write back against it. I think if anything, it's become a bit worse. Yeah.
I have to agree with that.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Asian family.
Yes.
But looking at the with your novel, did you find that the Chinese community was really happy about what you had written? Did people write to you and say, "Oh my God, that's wonderful to know that side of our history"?
Do you know what's funny is I've had both. I've had sometimes I feel like maybe you know, some Chinese people feel maybe I'm not Chinese enough to tell the story. I have had that vibe, but then definitely like it's been translated into Chinese now, and it's published in China now, and it's been and it's been like the feedback on that has been, I mean, actually, you know, like in China has been really good, and the translator and that sort of thing. And so I get a bit of both. I think, I get a bit of both. I get a lot of, you know, enthusiasm from some Chinese people, and then others, I mean, it's like anything. And then others are like, is it really like that? You know, like, it's just like anything, a bit of both.
Interesting. Bit of both. Well, at times we could go talking for ages.
I know.
Mirandi. Yeah, it's just, I love the fact that your books are so, there's so many different issues being discussed there that make you really think about the other, really, isn't it? So, all the best with your future projects. And
thank you, Janet.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing you back in Bali for our next Writers Festival on the ground.
I'm so looking forward to being back in Ubud.
Yes, I'm looking forward to having you back. So thank you so much. And for those people who haven't read your book, they must buy a copy, because it's a really important part of Australian history, and of course the contribution that Chinese made to our history. So thank you so much. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you very much.
So thank you everybody for watching this session. Yeah.
Sorry.
And thank you for supporting. Oh, yeah, no, just finish off the last bit. Thank you for supporting the Yayasan Mudra Swari Saraswati Patrons Program and to the festival partners who have made the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival possible. Please follow Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com for more information about the program. Terima kasih.